An education crisis largely orchestrated by neoconservatives in both the Republican and Democratic parties has left some of the country's oldest and most prestigious public universities struggling under deep cuts and severe budget shortfalls. And although these cuts are driven mostly by conservative think tanks, the changing face of education isn't just about austerity. It's no coincidence that some of the deepest cuts have come against social sciences, the humanities, and the arts, all subjects that are traditionally the target of some of the GOP's harshest critics. And despite these staggering cuts, though, football coaches continue to earn massive record salaries. And simultaneously, thanks to rising tuition costs and a poor job market, students are struggling under record-breaking levels of debt. It's an economic bubble that some predict could burst with devastating effects similar to the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. And our old friends at Wall Street are ready to step into the gaps created by the neocons' cuts, offering a new form of education, one that treats learning as a commodity and students as consumers. Now, neocons in Congress have argued for allowing more for-profit universities to receive accreditation, while the Investing in Student Success Act would see students become indentured servants of big corporations in return for their education. Now, to learn more about the devastating effect this is having on young people's futures, I'm joined today by Steve Mims, the writer and director of Starving the Beast, a 2016 documentary about the privatization of public education that premiered in March at the SXSW Film Festival. And I first asked him to explain how think tanks like the Heritage Foundation want to transform education and what's really wrong with more for-profit colleges. Check it out.
Our film is about a radical approach to public universities. And so you kind of have to section it off from for-profit schools. I mean, that was the thing that's already happening, is still happening, but the kind of movement to change the nature of the whole structural nature of public universities is what our film is about. And those guys basically, by around 2008, started formulating ideas for changing the whole nature of how public universities are funded, how they're organized in terms of tenure, how they would like to see research essentially separated from teaching, and the migration of the funds for research going into the private sector. And so, that reform movement that started in 2008 came after about 30 years of reduced funding for public higher ed. And what happened, this is what the film was kind of framed, what happened is, the funding in general is around 60% state funding for public universities. And by this year, it's down to around 12%. And so that gradual decline has shifted the burden of costs from the over onto the families and onto the students. And so by 2008, there was already a big uproar about that because, as you know, like the story about public higher ed and about higher ed in general is about student debt. And so you have a situation that's been caused by this defunding, and then the solution to it was proposed by think tanks. And so that's the nature of how they got involved with trying to radically change the way public universities work.
And Steve, I'm really glad you talked about that because a lot of your movie, Starving the Beast, is a debate between education as a public good and education as a commodity and students as consumers. Why is it so damaging to look at education in that lens?
Well, it's just two different ways of looking at the same problem. And so initially, when public universities were invented, if you can go all the way back to UVA and to University of North Carolina, the people there knew that they needed to give people who weren't wealthy a way to get an excellent public education. Those schools are excellent today. And if you look at what happened in 1862 when Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act into law, that provided federal funding, federal land basically, to be used to finance schools all over the country. And so now, all these years later, we have these really important economic engines all over the country that are public higher ed schools and that are very elite. So we can have places like UT Austin and the University of Wisconsin that are competitive with the highly funded private schools. And so, but that was done with an idea that we're gonna take the state's money, we're gonna pour it into these schools, and that money's gonna come back to us through people who are well educated, who are gonna live there and make the states better. And that's really been the secret in many ways to the success of the United States, is that we have these accessible, excellent programs. So that was it's a public good. It's like you're going to do that. The alternate view now is a more libertarian view that says that if you're going to walk out of a school like the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree that has a market value, then you should be prepared to cover the cost of that, or pay cover a lot more of that burden. And so, from a financial standpoint, that's the logic. And then there's the business standpoint where they look at it and say, like, look, these are bloated, inefficient institutions. They have bad labor contracts, as exemplified by tenure, and they're outdated. In the days of Google and what we have now, that these things are relics and they need to be rebuilt. The thing that we've seen happen is that we now have students who have enormous debt. It's harder. It's a question of access, about people getting into these schools. And ultimately, it's about the long-term prognosis for the country in terms of whether or not we're going to continue to have truly excellent schools, or if they're going to be diminished. And which is another part of this idea, is that the idea is that, like, it costs too much to run these places. They've got to teach more people. They've got to charge less. So are we going to let that happen? Is that a good strategy for the country, or is it a better strategy to say, like, look, we're now realizing that the reduction in funds is severe, and, like, you can see it as a conflict and as a potentially terrible development for really important universities all over the country, and universities that aren't elite. Like, it's an issue for all these public universities, how they can survive in the face of a logic and a campaign that says, look, we can't afford to do this anymore, and if we're going to continue to do it, it's going to be on radically different terms.
And we just have 2 minutes left here, but I really want to talk about the point that you just made about really high tuition costs. What are income share agreements, and how would the Investing in Student Success Act change how students pay for their education?
Well, this is a really kind of amazing thing. It's in the film, and it is a law. It's not been passed. It's a bill that would make it possible for people to basically sell themselves to an entity like a corporation or an individual, who would basically, when I say sell themselves, what happens is you approach a corporation and you say, I'm going to major in whatever, and they say, okay, here's your tuition money. We'll pay for your education. Well, the deal is that in exchange for that, you're to pay them 15% up to 15% of your income for up to 30 years. You're talking about a lifetime's worth of work, where you will pay 15%, and that, obviously, if you're successful, that percentage will go up over a lifetime. So that is an option that's a legitimate piece of legislation that's been proposed that a lot of people think is a good solution. And it gets a great response in the film because it's a shocking proposal if you think about the ramifications of it. And you can also see where you'd have a kid who comes, 18, 19 years old, and they hear that and they go like, wow, well, this is an acceptable opportunity for me, and not really realizing the ramifications of that. So it's just one of many things that have been proposed to change not just the rules for how these schools work, but the financing of a public education.
Right, and that makes total sense because tuition really is becoming so expensive for students. Thank you so much, Steve Mims, director of Starving the Beast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.